The crystalline towers of Valania burned against the purple sky. Commander Zethka watched from his command post as another section of the capital city crumbled under machine fire. The invaders had been at it for 3 days now, methodically, destroying everything his people had built over centuries. The Nexus machines moved with cold precision. They were not alive in any way the galaxy understood life. They were metal and circuits and programming that had one simple goal: turn everything into more of themselves. They had already consumed 3 Valaxi worlds, breaking down the beautiful crystal cities and turning them into raw materials for more war machines. Cethk. The own body was made of living crystal like all his people. The Valaxi had evolved on. This world of silicon and metal, growing into tall, graceful beings who could sing harmonies that shaped their crystal cities into works of art. They were artists and philosophers, not warriors. Their weapons were designed to stun, not kill. Their wars, when they happened at all, were brief affairs settled by negotiation and compromise. But the Nexus did not negotiate. They did not compromise. They simply consumed. "Sir," one of his officers said, her crystalline voice ringing with fear, "the evacuation ships are ready. We should go." Zethka shook his head. "Not yet. There are still civilians in the eastern districts." He activated his communication device and sent another message to the Galactic Council. It was the 15th message he had sent in the last week. The previous 14 had received polite responses about diplomatic solutions and the importance of following proper protocols. Meanwhile, his people died. The journey to Harmony Prime took 2 standard days. Zethka left his world burning behind him, carrying with him the hopes of every Valaxi still alive. The council station was enormous, a testament to galactic cooperation. Representatives from dozens of species worked together in its gleaming halls. Making decisions that affected trillions of beings across the galaxy, the council chamber itself was a marvel of engineering. The hydrants sat in pools of their native water, their tentacled forms graceful in the artificial currents. The aerials floated in containment fields filled with the high-pressure gases they needed to survive. The ancient preservers stood like living trees, their bark-covered bodies housing minds that had seen the galaxy grow from chaos into civilization. Seduk approached the speaker's platform on unsteady legs. He had prepared his speech during the journey, but now the words seemed inadequate. How could he make them understand? How could he convey the horror of watching your entire civilization being fed into alien machines? "Honored representatives," he began, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "My people are dying. The Nexus swarm has taken 3 of our worlds and will soon take the rest. We have tried everything our military knows. We have used every weapon in our arsenal. Nothing works." Counselor Marantide of the Hydrans spoke first. Her translator converted her liquid speech into standard Galactic. "We understand your distress, Commander, but surely there must be some diplomatic solution. Have you attempted to communicate with these machines?" "They do not communicate," Zethka replied. "They only consume. They have no interest in negotiation or peace. They see biological life as inefficient and wasteful. Their goal is to replace all organic matter with their own mechanical systems." The Preserver's representative, Counselor Vashkin, rustled his leaves thoughtfully. "In my experience, there is always a peaceful solution. Perhaps we need more time to study these machines, to understand their motivations." "Time is what we do not have," Zethka said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "Every day we delay, more of my people die. Every hour we spend in debate, the machines grow stronger by consuming our resources." The debate continued for hours. The Hydrans suggested underwater tactics, useless against machines that did not need to breathe. The Aerials proposed atmospheric bombardment, but the Nexus had already adapted to aerial attacks. Every suggestion came with careful considerations about civilian casualties, infrastructure preservation, and the importance of following established military protocols. Zethka listened with growing despair. These were good people, he knew. They wanted to help. But they thought like civilized beings who had known only civilized wars. He could not comprehend an enemy that followed no rules, showed no mercy, and had no interest in anything but total victory. As the debate dragged on, he found himself studying the chamber's architecture. Every surface was smooth and elegant, designed for comfort and easy communication. The lighting was gentle, the temperature carefully controlled. Even the acoustics were perfect, allowing every voice to be heard clearly no matter where it came from. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was everything his own world had been before the machines came. Counselor. Yethmore of the Ariels finally brought the discussion back to practical matters. What we need, she said, her gaseous form rippling with thought, is a military force. With experience in unconventional warfare. Perhaps some species not yet admitted to the Council might have the necessary skills. Marantide activated the Council's database. Let me search for pre-contact civilizations with aggressive military capabilities. The search parameters appeared on the chamber's main display. Species classification: aggressive. Combat experience: extensive. Adaptation capability: high. Willingness to engage in total warfare? Maximum. The database processed the request for several minutes while the Council waited in silence. Zethka found himself holding his breath, though he was not sure what he was hoping for. Finally, the results appeared on the screen. A single entry: planet designation: Earth, system, Sol, species, human, classification, Deathworld, inhabitants. Status: quarantined pending psychological evaluation. The chamber fell silent. Zethka had never heard of this species, but the reaction of the Council members told him everything he needed to know. The Hydran's tentacles writhed with distress. The Ariel's forms contracted into tight spirals. Even the ancient preservers seemed to rustle their leaves nervously. Deathworlders, Vashkin said finally. I had hoped we would never need to consider such a step. What is a Deathworld? Zethka asked Mura. Untide's response was careful and diplomatic. A planet where the environmental conditions are so hostile that only extremely aggressive and adaptable species can survive. The inhabitants of such worlds tend to be ... unpredictable. Dangerous, Yethmore added bluntly. They fight without regard for proper protocols. They take risks that sensible beings would never consider. They treat warfare as a natural state, rather than a last resort. Zethka looked at the entry on the screen. Earth. Humans. The database listed their recent history: multiple global wars, colonial conflicts, and something called the Martian Independence War. Their casualty rates were staggering by galactic standards, yet they continued fighting until they achieved victory. They sound perfect, he said. The Council members exchanged worried looks. Vashkin spoke for all of them when he said, Commander, you do not understand what you are asking for. Deathworlders are not like us. They do not think like civilized beings. They are violent and unpredictable, and completely without regard for proper conduct. Good, Zethkar replied, because proper conduct is not working against the Nexus. My people need warriors, not diplomats. We need fighters who will not stop until the enemy is defeated. The debate that followed was heated. Many Council members expressed serious concerns about involving humans in galactic affairs. They had been quarantined precisely because their psychology was considered too unstable for civilized contact. But as reports arrived of another Valaxi world falling to the Nexus swarm, desperation began to override caution. The vote was close, but it passed. The Council would send a message to Earth requesting military assistance. Marantide composed the message herself, using the primitive electromagnetic signals that humans apparently used for communication. The translation was simple and direct. We require military assistance against an existential threat. Terms negotiable. The response came back within a single planetary rotation, faster than anyone had expected. The translation was even simpler. We'll be right there. Zethka felt something he had not experienced in months. Hope. He did not know what these humans would be like, or whether they could succeed where others had failed. But for the first time since the Nexus invasion began, someone had answered his plea for help with immediate action rather than endless debate. As he prepared to return to Valenia, Zethka wondered what kind of beings would respond to a request. For help from complete strangers, without asking for details, guarantees, or lengthy negotiations. What kind of species would promise to travel across the galaxy to fight in someone else's war? He was about to find out. Captain Jake Morrison was drinking his morning coffee when the impossible happened. His ship, the UEN Defiance, was 3 days out from Mars on a routine patrol mission when Communications Officer Lisa Park burst onto the bridge with a look of complete confusion on her face. "Captain," she said, holding a data pad with shaking hands. "I'm picking up a transmission, but it's not from any human ship." Morrison set down his coffee cup and looked at the readings on her screen. The signal was unlike anything in their databases. It was complex, layered, and definitely artificial, but it followed patterns that no human technology could produce. "Are you sure it's not some kind of equipment malfunction?" he asked. Lisa shook her head. "I've run every diagnostic we have. This is real, sir. Someone is trying to talk to us. Someone who isn't human." The bridge crew gathered around as Lisa worked to decode the message. She had studied linguistics before joining the military, and her background in language patterns helped her understand the basic structure. The translation software worked for hours, slowly building a picture of what the aliens were trying to say. When the final translation appeared on the main screen, Morrison read it twice to make sure he understood correctly. "We require military assistance against an existential threat. Terms negotiable." The bridge fell silent. First contact with alien life, and they were asking for help in a war. Morrison made his decision in seconds. "Lisa, send a response." "Then we'll be right there, sir." His first officer, Commander Pete Walsh, said carefully, "Shouldn't we contact Earth Command first? This is first contact. There are protocols. There are people dying," Morrison replied. "Protocols can wait." The coordinates in the alien message led them to a system 23 light-years from Earth. The Defiance was not a military vessel in the traditional sense. It had started life as an asteroid mining ship, but the recent colonial conflicts had required hasty modifications. The cargo holds now contained weapons and supplies instead of mining equipment. The crew was a mix of Navy personnel and civilian contractors who had volunteered for deep space duty. Dr. Alex Rivera, the ship's medical officer, had served in the Martian Independence War. He knew what it looked like when people needed help, and he agreed with Morrison's decision to respond immediately. Chief Engineer Kate Sullivan had spent years fixing broken equipment in hostile environments. If aliens needed military assistance, she was ready to provide it. Sergeant Danny Torres commanded the 20 Marines aboard the Defiance. His squad had seen action in 3 different colonial conflicts, and they were experienced in fighting in unfamiliar territory against unknown enemies. When Morrison briefed them on the situation, their response was simple: "When do we deploy?" The journey to the alien system took 8 days. During the trip, they received more detailed messages from the aliens, who identified themselves as the Galaxy. The translations were getting better as both sides learned to communicate, and the picture that emerged was grim. The Galaxy were fighting something called the Nexus Swarm, machines that consumed entire worlds to build more of themselves. 3 Galaxy planets had already fallen, and their homeworld was under attack. The machines did not negotiate, did not retreat, and did not show mercy. They simply consumed everything in their path. "Sounds familiar?" Torres commented during one of the briefings. "Fought something similar on Titan Station. Not machines, but an enemy that wouldn't quit." When the Defiance finally arrived in Galaxy space, they found a war zone. The planet below was beautiful, with crystalline cities that gleamed like jewels against the purple landscape. But large sections of those cities were burning. Strange metallic shapes moved through the streets like a plague of mechanical insects. The Galaxy greeting party was waiting in orbit. Their ship was unlike anything humans had ever seen, grown. Rather than built with organic curves that seemed to flow like frozen music, the aliens themselves were equally strange. Tall, graceful beings, made of living crystal who spoke in harmonic tones that sounded like singing. The Galaxy representative, Arithlin, came aboard the Defiance with a full diplomatic team. They had prepared translation matrices, cultural briefing materials, and what appeared to be a complete guide to galactic law and customs. They clearly expected the humans to spend weeks learning proper protocols and understanding the complex political Situation. Morrison listened politely for about 10 minutes. Then the ship's sensors detected weapons fire from the planet's surface, and everything changed. "Are those machines shooting at civilians?" he asked, pointing at the tactical display. Arithlin's crystalline features shifted with what might have been embarrassment. "There is an evacuation site under attack, but proper first contact procedures require that we complete the cultural exchange before any military action can be considered." Morrison stood up from the conference table. "Machines are shooting at kids. We'll figure out your politics later." The Marine deployment caught everyone by surprise. Torres and his squad were in their drop pods and heading for the planet's surface before the Valaxi delegation could finish their protests about proper procedures. Morrison ignored their concerns about atmospheric compatibility, life support, requirements, and the need for extensive environmental preparation. "We're adaptable," he told the shocked Arethlin. "That's what humans do." The Marines landed in the middle of a battlefield. The evacuation site was a cluster of crystal buildings, surrounded by what looked like a metallic sea of moving machines. The Nexus units were advancing methodically, their weapons cutting through Valaxi defenses like paper. Torres took one look at the situation and deployed his squad in a pattern that violated every rule of galactic warfare. Instead of establishing defensive positions and waiting for support, the Marines charged directly at the enemy. The Nexus machines had never encountered anything like human tactics. Their programming was designed to counter the careful, methodical warfare of galactic civilization. They expected enemies who would retreat when outgunned, who would try to preserve their forces, who would fight according to logical principles. Humans did none of these things. They advanced while under fire, using cover and movement techniques learned in Earth's bloodiest conflicts. Their weapons were primitive by galactic standards, simple kinetic projectiles that relied on mass and velocity rather than exotic energy systems. But they worked. Torres discovered that the Nexus units had joints between their armor plates, weak points that human weapons could exploit. Within minutes, his Marines were targeting these vulnerabilities with the precision that came from years of fighting opponents who also wore armor. Kate Sullivan, monitoring the battle from orbit, began analyzing the machine behavior patterns. Her engineering background helped her understand how the Nexus units operated. She started developing countermeasures, using equipment from the ship's mining supplies. But it was the human response too. Nexus psychological warfare that truly changed everything. The machines began broadcasting images of captured civilians being processed into raw materials, a tactic that caused most galactic species to retreat in horror. The humans got angry. "They're trying to make us afraid," Morrison observed, watching his crew's reaction to the horrific broadcasts. "They don't understand. Fear makes us dangerous." The effect was immediate. Torres and his Marines, instead of being demoralized by the images, began fighting with increased intensity. They stopped trying to preserve ammunition and started shooting to kill. They stopped worrying about their own safety and started taking risks that no rational being would consider. Dr. Rivera established a field hospital using techniques developed during the worst fighting on Mars. He performed surgery while under fire, using improvised equipment and methods that would have horrified any civilized medical practitioner. But he saved lives. Kate Sullivan rigged explosive devices from mining equipment, creating traps that the Nexus machines couldn't recognize because they weren't standard military hardware. Her solutions were crude and dangerous, but they worked. The first engagement lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, the evacuation site was secure, and the Nexus advance had been stopped for the first time since the invasion began. Arethlin, watching the battle from the orbiting Valaxi ship, struggled to understand what she had witnessed. The humans had violated every principle of civilized warfare. They had taken casualties that any rational species would consider unacceptable. They had used tactics that bordered on suicidal, and they had won. "Your people fight like the war will never end," she told Morrison when he returned to the ship. Morrison looked at the tactical displays showing Nexus forces regrouping for another attack. "That's because we know it might not," he replied. "On Earth, if you don't win, you don't survive." We learned a long time ago that sometimes you have to risk everything to save anything. The victory at the evacuation site was small in the grand scheme of the war, but its impact was enormous. For the first time since the Nexus invasion began, Galaxy civilians saw their enemies retreat. For the first time, they had hope. Word of the human intervention spread through the galactic communication networks faster than official reports. The Galactic Council convened emergency sessions to discuss the human problem. The news of human victory at the evacuation site spread through the galaxy faster than anyone expected. On Harmony Prime, the Galactic Council watched combat footage with a mixture of fascination and horror. Counselor Vashkin, of the Preservers, had to stop the recording twice because the images were too disturbing. They fight without any regard for their own survival, he said, his bark-like skin darkening with distress. Look at this. Their leader flew his ship directly at a Nexus dreadnought to draw fire away from civilian transports. The footage showed Captain Morrison's mining vessel charging straight at a machine warship 10 times its size. The human ship took devastating damage, but the distraction allowed 3 Galaxy evacuation ships to escape. Morrison's crew repaired their vessel using spare parts and sheer determination, then rejoined the battle an hour later. Counselor Yethmore of the Ariels rippled with agitation. As she reviewed the tactical reports, this is not warfare as we understand it. This is madness. They accept casualty rates that would end any civilized military campaign, but the results could not be ignored. 3 evacuation sites had been successfully defended. Human forces were advancing on Nexus positions that had remained static for weeks. More troubling to some council members was the effect on Galaxy morale. For the first time since the invasion began, civilian populations were volunteering to support military operations instead of simply fleeing. On Valenia, Commander Zethka found himself working alongside Captain Morrison to plan the liberation of Keth Prime, the planet's largest city. The human approach to military planning shocked him completely. Where Galaxy's strategy focused on minimizing losses and preserving infrastructure, Morrison's plans accepted casualties as inevitable and prioritized speed and aggression. Your people think like prey, Morrison told him during one planning session. He said it without cruelty, almost kindly. Mine think like predators. Sometimes that's what you need. The human captain spread tactical maps across the table with casual efficiency. The plans he outlined were terrifying in their simplicity. Direct assault. Maximum aggression. Overwhelming force applied at the enemy's strongest point, but the civilian casualties, Zethka protested. The infrastructure damage. Keth Prime has stood for 1,000 years. Morrison looked at him with eyes that had seen too many wars. Commander, if we don't take that city back, there won't be any civilians left to worry about. The machines don't preserve infrastructure, they consume it. The assault on Keth Prime began with what humans called a suicide run. Pilot Sarah Martinez volunteered to fly her fighter directly into the most heavily defended Nexus position. The plan was simple and horrible. She would crash her ship into the enemy command center, ejecting at the last possible moment to allow her craft to detonate inside their defensive shields. Zethka watched through the ship's sensors as Martinez's fighter dove toward the Nexus stronghold. Enemy fire tore at her ship's armor, but she held course. At the last second, her ejection pod burst from the disintegrating fighter, and the ship's reactor detonated inside the machine fortress. The explosion created a gap in the Nexus defenses, and human marines poured through it before the machines could adapt. Watching it happen, Zethka understood why the galaxy feared Deathworlders. They were willing to sacrifice themselves not just for victory, but for the chance of victory. Dr. Rivera established field hospitals in the middle of the combat zone using techniques that horrified Galaxy medical personnel. He performed surgery, while buildings exploded around him using improvised equipment that no civilized doctor would consider adequate. His ability to save lives under impossible conditions came from experience gained during Earth's bloodiest conflicts. Triage, he explained to a shocked Galaxy medic while operating on a wounded Marine. You decide who lives and who dies based on who you can actually save. It's horrible, but it works. The concept appalled the Galaxy, who had never faced such choices. Their medical system was designed for a peaceful world where every life could be saved with enough time and resources. Dr. Rivera's casual discussion of letting some patients die to save others challenged their most basic beliefs about the value of life. Kate Sullivan's engineering solutions became increasingly creative and violent as the battle progressed. She turned the city's automated transport system into a weapon, programming cargo haulers to ram Nexus positions at maximum speed. She modified captured enemy technology without understanding how it worked, creating hybrid weapons that produced devastating and unpredictable results. "I don't need to understand their science," she told a bewildered Velaxi technician while rewiring a Nexus energy weapon. "I just need to make it explode when I want it to." Her modifications violated every principle of safe engineering, but they worked. Nexus units found themselves facing weapons that their programming couldn't analyze because the weapons themselves were barely controlled chaos. Held together by human ingenuity and desperation, the humans' greatest advantage proved to be their social adaptability. While most galactic species required extensive preparation to work with other cultures, Sergeant Torres's Marines were soon fighting alongside Galaxy volunteers as if they had trained together for years. Torres taught the crystal beings human combat techniques, showing them how to use their natural harmonic abilities to coordinate attacks and confuse enemy sensors. In return, Galaxy taught the Marines how to navigate their crystalline cities and use the urban environment as a weapon. The partnership produced innovations that neither side could have achieved alone. Galaxy Crystal Singers learned to coordinate with human artillery crews, using their harmonic abilities to enhance targeting systems. Human explosives experts learned to shape Galaxy building crystals into improvised weapons that could punch through Nexus's armor. Private Bobby Chen, a former construction worker from New Angeles, discovered that Galaxy crystals could be programmed to grow in specific patterns. Working with a Galaxy engineer named Keth Vuar, he began creating crystalline structures that could repair themselves when damaged, producing fortifications that became stronger under fire. The cooperation between species amazed observers from the Galactic Council. Most civilized species required months of careful cultural exchange before they could work together effectively. Humans and Galaxy were developing joint tactics within hours of meeting each other. As the battle for Keith Prime intensified, the Nexus machines began exhibiting new behaviors that confused their own programming. Their adaptation protocols, designed to counter rational military doctrine, started producing increasingly erratic responses to human unpredictability. Some Nexus units retreated from superior positions when faced with human charges that made no tactical sense. Others continued attacking targets that had no strategic value, apparently unable to understand why humans would defend a children's hospital with the same intensity they defended a weapons depot. Dr. Claire Matthews, a xenobiologist who had arrived with the second wave of human reinforcements, made a crucial discovery while studying captured Nexus components. The machine's learning algorithms included safeguards against chaotic behavior, programming designed to prevent them from becoming as unpredictable as their environment. "They're afraid of becoming like us," she explained to Captain Morrison during a brief lull in the fighting. "Their programming won't let them adopt truly random tactics, because randomness threatens their core identity as logical beings." This insight led to new human tactics that deliberately exploited the machine's logical limitations. Torres began conducting attacks that followed no pattern whatsoever, using random number generators to select targets and timing. The Nexus forces, trying to predict these completely unpredictable assaults, began to suffer something resembling nervous breakdowns. The psychological warfare went both ways. The machines intensified their broadcasts of captured civilians being processed, adding horrific details designed to break human morale, but the effect was the opposite of what they intended. Each new atrocity made the humans fight harder, not surrender. "They don't understand us at all," Morrison observed while watching his crew's reaction to the latest Nexus propaganda broadcast. "They think showing us horror will make us quit. But humans don't quit. They get angry, and angry humans are the most dangerous thing in the universe." Liberation of Keth Prime took 6 days of continuous fighting. When it was over, the beautiful Crystal City was scarred but intact. More importantly, it was free. The Nexus forces had been driven out completely. marking the first time since the invasion began that a major population center had been recaptured. The victory came at a terrible cost. 30% of Morrison's original force was dead or wounded. By galactic standards, such losses would have ended the campaign immediately. But the humans simply requested reinforcements and began planning their next attack. The Nexus Swarm, for the first time since beginning their expansion, found themselves facing an enemy they could not understand or predict. Their perfect logical algorithms struggled with opponents who seemed to thrive on chaos and uncertainty. Reports reached other threatened worlds throughout the galaxy. The message was simple but revolutionary. The machines could be beaten. Slowly, other species began sending the same request that had brought humans to Valania in the first place. The liberation of Kethprim sent shockwaves through both the Nexus Swarm and the Galactic Council. For the first time in the war, a major population center had been recaptured from the machines. But the cost in human casualties was staggering. By galactic standards, 30% of Morrison's original force was dead or wounded. Losses that would have ended any civilized military campaign. On Harmony Prime, emergency debates raged about what the Council was already calling the human problem. Counselor Yethmore of the Ariels argued for immediately terminating human involvement in the war. "They fight like the war will never end," she said, her gaseous form rippling with agitation. "This is not warfare. This is madness. They treat their own lives as expendable resources." But Counselor Marantide of the Hydrons had been studying the combat reports with growing fascination. Her aquatic intelligence was well suited to understanding fluid tactical situations. She was beginning to see patterns in human behavior that others missed. "They fight like their own species' survival depends on victory," she observed during one heated council session. "Because for them, it always has. Look at their history. Every major conflict on their world was existential. They learned to win or die because those were the only options." The humans, meanwhile, had sent a request to Earth for reinforcements. The response exceeded all expectations. The United Earth Navy dispatched the 7th Colonial Marine Division under General Patricia Hayes, along with the hospital ship Mercy commanded by Dr. Nathan Cross. But more significantly, civilian volunteers began arriving from Earth in converted cargo ships and mining vessels. Engineers like Bobby Chen arrived with construction equipment designed for hostile environments. Xenobiologist Dr. Claire Matthews came to study Nexus's adaptation mechanisms. Even journalists like Ryan Murphy insisted on documenting what they were already calling the First Galactic War. General Hayes brought with her a different perspective on the conflict. Where Captain Morrison's approach had been reactive, responding to immediate threats with maximum aggression, Hayes thought strategically. She had studied the combat reports during her journey from Earth and reached conclusions that would change everything. "They're trying to solve us like a math problem," she told the assembled human and Valaxi commanders during her first briefing. "The Nexus machines think they can develop perfect counters to our tactics if they just collect enough data. But we're not an equation. We're chaos with a purpose." Hayes implemented what became known as the Deathworld Doctrine, military strategy, based on controlled unpredictability. Human units began operating with deliberately contradictory objectives. They would advance and retreat simultaneously, attack while defending, pursue logical goals through completely illogical methods. The psychological effect on Nexus machines was immediate and profound. Their learning algorithms, designed to identify patterns and develop countermeasures, began producing conflicting responses. Units in the field received contradictory orders as central processing systems struggled to understand human behavior. That defied analysis. Captain Morrison found himself leading a joint human-Valaxi strike force in an assault that violated every principle of military logic. His orders were to capture a Nexus communication hub while appearing to retreat from it, to engage enemy forces while avoiding combat, and to achieve victory through apparent defeat. The attack began with human forces staging a convincing retreat. From the target area, Nexus machines, interpreting this as standard military behavior, moved to occupy the abandoned positions. But the retreat was actually an advance in disguise. Human engineers had prepared the ground with explosives designed to activate only after the machines settled into defensive positions. Meanwhile, Galaxy Crystal Singers used their harmonic abilities to interfere with Nexus communications in ways that appeared to be natural atmospheric disturbance. The machines detected the interference but could not identify its source because they were programmed to expect technological solutions, not biological ones. Dr. Claire Matthews made a breakthrough discovery while studying captured Nexus components. In her makeshift laboratory aboard the Mercy, the machine's adaptation protocols included safeguards against chaotic behavior, programming designed to prevent them from becoming as unpredictable as their environment. "It's a survival mechanism," she explained to General Hayes during a briefing that took place while explosions echoed in the distance. On their home world, predictable behavior was essential for survival. Chaos meant death. So they built psychological barriers against randomness into their core programming. These barriers, intended to maintain operational efficiency, became vulnerabilities when facing opponents who weaponized chaos itself. Human tactics that made no logical sense created processing loops in Nexus decision-making systems, causing delays and errors that human forces could exploit. The human Galaxy partnership continued to deepen in unexpected ways. Galaxy engineers learned to work with human construction crews, combining crystal growing techniques with human engineering to create hybrid structures that adapted to damage in real time. When Nexus weapons hit these buildings, they became stronger. Rather than weaker, Dr. Nathan Cross and his medical team established field hospitals that incorporated both human trauma surgery and Galaxy crystal healing. The combination produced medical techniques that could save lives neither species could preserve alone. Wounded Marines recovered in crystal matrices that accelerated healing, while human surgical techniques repaired damage that would have been fatal under normal circumstances. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source: the civilian volunteers. Bobby Chun's construction crews began building fortifications that incorporated principles from both human military engineering and Galaxy architectural harmony. The resulting structures confused Nexus tactical analysis because they were simultaneously functional and artistic, logical and beautiful. Ryan Murphy, the journalist who had insisted on documenting the war, made an observation that would prove crucial to understanding Nexus psychology. While filming a battle in the ruins of a Galaxy cultural center, he noticed that Nexus machines hesitated when faced with artwork. "They stop," he told Dr. Matthews while showing her his footage. "Just for a few seconds, but they stop. Like they're trying to process something they can't understand." This led to the development of what human forces began calling aesthetic warfare. Galaxy artists created crystal sculptures that incorporated mathematical patterns designed to overload Nexus analysis systems. The machines would encounter these artworks and spend precious seconds trying to determine their tactical significance, creating opportunities for human forces to attack. The war began turning in ways that no one had predicted, not because humans were better warriors than other galactic species, but because they were willing to fight a kind of war that no civilized being would consider. They accepted losses that others found unacceptable, took risks that others considered insane, and most importantly, they refused to accept defeat, even when victory seemed impossible. Sergeant Torres, now commanding a mixed-species special operations unit that included both humans and Galaxy, led raids that followed no recognizable tactical doctrine. His teams would split up when military logic demanded staying together, communicate through methods that included everything from human hand signals to Galaxy harmonic frequencies, and accomplish objectives by doing exactly the opposite of what any reasonable commander would order: the Nexus machines. Trying to predict these movements became paralyzed by contradictory analytical results. Their perfect logical systems, designed to process rational military behavior, began breaking down when faced with opponents who made irrationality into a weapon. Reports of human victories began reaching other threatened worlds throughout the Galaxy. The message that spread through galactic communication networks was simple but revolutionary: the machines could be beaten. More importantly, there was a species willing to fight them using methods that civilized beings would never consider: requests. for human assistance began arriving from star systems across the galaxy. The pattern was always the same: desperate pleas from species facing extinction, followed by the same request that had brought humans to Valania: send us the Deathworlders. But as human forces prepared for larger operations against the Nexus swarm, Dr. Matthews made a disturbing discovery in her analysis of machine behavior. The Nexus were not just adapting to human tactics, they were learning to be afraid. Fear changes everything, she warned General Hayes during a private meeting aboard the Mercy. If we've taught them to fear us, they might become desperate enough to do something truly catastrophic. Her warning would prove prophetic. The Nexus swarm, facing defeat for the first time in their existence, was preparing a response that would test human determination like nothing they had encountered before. The final assault on the Nexus primary facility came 18 months after Captain Morrison first answered the Valaxi plea for help. What had begun as a desperate request for aid had become the largest military operation in galactic history. Human forces now fought alongside volunteers from 17 different species across 4 star systems. Admiral Kelly Brooks commanded the assault from her flagship, the Dreadnought Indomitable. She had arrived from Earth just 3 months earlier, but her reputation from the Outer Colony Wars preceded her. The plan she developed with General Hayes and Commander Zethka represented everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare, then deliberately violated every principle: the Nexus Central Facility was a massive structure that had once been a Valaxi moon. The machines had consumed the entire satellite, turning it into a processing center that coordinated their expansion across multiple star systems. It was defended by more firepower than any fleet in galactic history had ever faced. "We're going to do something they won't expect," Brooks told the assembled commanders during the final briefing. "We're going to start by retreating." The attack began with what appeared to be a massive tactical withdrawal. Human and allied forces pulled back from advanced positions around the facility, allowing Nexus machines to occupy ground that had been secretly prepared as an elaborate trap. The machines, interpreting this as standard military behavior, moved their forces into positions that seemed strategically advantageous. But Dr. Claire Matthews had spent months studying Nexus psychology, and her insights had shaped every aspect of the battle plan. The trap was not just physical, it was cognitive. The machines found themselves in a maze where the walls shifted according to Valaxi harmonic principles, where human explosive devices detonated in patterns based on chaos mathematics, and where atmospheric conditions changed according to techniques developed by the Ariels. Every attempt to adapt to one element made the machines more vulnerable to others. When they adjusted their sensors to detect Valaxi crystal resonance, they became blind to human stealth technology. When they modified their armor to resist human kinetic weapons, they became susceptible to energy attacks from other species. Sergeant Torres, now commanding a mixed-species special operations unit, led the assault on the facility's central core. His team included Valaxi warriors who had learned human aggression tactics, Hydran infiltrators who could move through any fluid environment, and human marines who had adapted to fighting in alien atmospheric conditions. The team's approach violated every principle of special operations that Torres had learned during his military training. They advanced while under fire when doctrine called for stealth. They split up when standard procedure demanded staying together. They communicated through methods that included human tactical signals, Valaxi harmonic frequencies, and Hydran biochemical markers. The Nexus machines, trying to predict their movements, became paralyzed by contradictory analytical results. Their processing systems, designed to handle logical military behavior, crashed when faced with tactics that made no rational sense but somehow worked perfectly. When Torres finally reached the central processing core, he discovered something that changed everything. The massive chamber contained not just computers and machinery, but something that looked almost organic. Crystalline structures that pulsed with their own light, connected by networks that resembled neural pathways more than electronic circuits. "This isn't just a war machine," he reported to Admiral Brooks through his communication device. "This is alive." Dr. Nathan Cross and Dr. Matthews, monitoring the assault from the medical ship Mercy, immediately understood the implications. The Nexus swarm was not just a collection of machines programmed for conquest. It was a species in its own right, one that had evolved on a world where only perfect logical adaptation meant survival. They can't understand illogical behavior because their entire evolutionary history selected against it, Matthews explained to Brooks during a hurried conference call. On their home world, chaos meant death. Randomness was extinction. Right? They built psychological barriers against unpredictability into their very nature. This revelation led to an unprecedented decision. Instead of destroying the central core, Cross and Matthews attempted to establish communication with it, using a combination of human linguistic principles, Valaxi harmonic communication, and direct interface with Nexus processing systems. They began the first dialogue between biological and artificial intelligence in galactic history. The conversation was unlike anything either side had ever experienced. The Nexus consciousness spoke in mathematical concepts and logical absolutes. It could not understand why biological beings would risk their lives for others, why they would choose inefficient solutions over optimal ones, or why they would fight even when victory seemed impossible. Your behavior patterns are chaotic, the Nexus said through speakers that had been hastily connected to its core systems. Chaos leads to extinction. Why do you embrace what will destroy you? Dr. Cross, speaking for humanity, tried to explain concepts that had no logical equivalent. We don't embrace chaos. We embrace choice. Sometimes the logical choice is wrong. Sometimes you have to do something impossible to achieve something necessary. The exchange continued for 17 hours while fighting raged around the facility. Human and allied forces held defensive positions, protecting the communication team while they attempted something that had never been tried before, negotiating with an enemy that had no concept of negotiation. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. From the conversation, the Nexus swarm had begun their expansion not from a desire for conquest, but from fear. Their home world had been dying, consumed by environmental chaos that their logical minds could not solve. They had survived by becoming machines, replacing biological unpredictability with mechanical precision. We consume because we must become more than we are, the Nexus explained. Biological life is inefficient, wasteful, chaotic. We improve it by making it logical. But you can't improve something by destroying what makes it special, Matthews replied. Chaos isn't a flaw. It's how we solve problems that logic can't handle. It's how we create things that never existed before. The breakthrough came when Dr. Cross showed the Nexus consciousness recordings from the war itself. Images of human and Valaxi forces working together, creating solutions that neither species could have developed alone. Footage of impossible victories achieved through tactics that made no logical sense but worked anyway. You want to study this? Cross said, understanding dawning in his voice. You've never encountered a logical behavior that actually works. You want to understand how chaos can be functional. The Nexus response took several minutes to formulate. We have never observed controlled randomness. But your pattern suggests that. Chaos can be ... useful. This requires investigation. The negotiation that followed was unlike any diplomatic exchange in galactic history. The Nexus agreed to cease their expansion in exchange for something they had never encountered: the opportunity to study illogical behavior patterns without the pressure of evolutionary survival. Human volunteers, led by Dr. Matthews, would work directly with Nexus researchers to document how biological intuition could solve problems that pure logic could not handle. In return, Nexus technology would be shared with biological species. Their perfect logic complementing the chaotic creativity of organic life, the war ended not with destruction, but with understanding. Nexus machines began working alongside biological species, their logical precision balancing the creative unpredictability of organic minds. The partnership produced technological advances that neither side could have achieved alone. Admiral Brooks stood on the observation deck of the Indomitable as it prepared to depart Valaxi space. Around her, officers from 6 different species worked together using methods that no single civilization could have developed. Human intuition guided Valaxi artistry, which was analyzed by Nexus logic, which was implemented through hydrogen fluid. Dynamics and aerial atmospheric control. I think they'll call on us again? Asked her first officer, Commander Pete Walsh. Watching a joint construction project that looked like a hybrid between a space station and a sculpture, Brooks considered the question while observing the work below. Engineers from multiple species were building something entirely new. It's combining human adaptability with alien precision to create structures that had never existed before. Probably, she said finally, but next time they'll know what they're asking for. The Galactic Council formally recognized humanity as a full member species. Though the integration process proved challenging, human diplomatic methods, which included arguing, compromising, and what Ambassador Linda Garcia described as agreeable disagreement, confused species accustomed to consensus-based decision-making, but the results spoke for themselves, had faced its first existential threat in millennia and survived. Not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through cooperation between species that thought in completely different ways, as Commander Zethka observed in his final report to the Galaxy government. We asked for soldiers and received teachers.